Shekalim. The Kriyas Torah for Parsha Shekalim, you'll recall, is the beginning of Parshas Kisisa that talks about giving a half shekel. And we're going to read Kisisa in 2 weeks anyway, so we're going to get a reprise of it. So what's interesting, though, is, and this is something a lot of people don't realize unless you learn the Parsha properly, that although we read it to commemorate the half shekel that was given for the korbanos, that is actually not the half shekel that the Torah is talking about. There was another half shekel that the Torah is talking about, and we're just borrowing it to apply it to the half shekel of the korbanos. And this was a one-time half shekel for the construction of the Mishkan. That when the Mishkan was constructed, so people were asked to give gold, silver, copper, whatever they want, and in addition, they gave a half shekel, and the half shekels were melted down and formed what are called adanim. The adanim are sockets, and it's silver, but it would resemble, let's say, a concrete block, a hollowed concrete block, and the idea would be that every board of the Mishkan, the boards of the Mishkan, had two teeth at the bottom, like the prongs of a plug, and each prong would be inserted into a silver socket, which is quite heavy, and that would give the boards stability. So when they took the Mishkan apart, kind of like Legos, when they took the Mishkan apart, they would pull the boards out of the sockets, and they would load the boards and the sockets on wagons and the like. So the adanim were the sockets in which the krushim, the boards, were put when they would assemble the Mishkan. And that happened to also be based on half shekel contributions. This is called trumas ha'adanim, the contribution for these sockets. And that is what Kisisa is talking about. Kisisa is actually not directly talking about the annual half shekel that went for korbanos. It's talking about the half shekel that was a one-time contribution, only one time, for the adanim of the Mishkan. Yeah.
Where did they have half shekels from? If they were just coming in the desert? Like what was the
where did they get it from? Yeah, that's interesting. So according to some midrashim, Moshe Rabbeinu minted the coins. He actually, made the coins. I mean, they had metal, silver. It's a silver coin. So Moshe Rabbeinu made a lot of silver coins. Now, here's an interesting question. The Adonim are the only part of the Mishkan that required a uniform donation. Meaning, normally, every person decided what they wanted to give. Gold, silver, copper, techelas. You could give as much or as little. See, again, it's the opposite of the korbanos we talked about yesterday was uniform. Everybody gave the same amount. That's for the korbanos. But for the construction of the Mishkan, bidafka, there was no uniformity requirement. Every person gave what they wanted to give. The only exception to that was the Adonim had to come from a uniform contribution of machzis shekel. Now, yesterday we talked about bi'arichos, that the uniformity of the machzis shekel of the korban teaches us rich and poor are equal in God's eyes. But here, there got to be some other meaning involved. This has to be a different idea, because here, you're not dealing with korbanos, you're dealing with construction. When it comes to construction, Hashem b'dafka doesn't ask for uniformity. We know that. You gave as much or as little as you wanted. So how come only when it comes to the Adonim, all of a sudden we're back to the concept of uniformity? Meaning, the point I'm making is, everything we said yesterday is not going to be an answer to this question. Because you can't say the Adonim teaches me uniformity, because if that would be the case, then all donations to the construction of the Mishkan should be uniform, and yet they are not. So why is it only this part of the Mishkan that compels that everybody gives the same thing, a half shekel of silver that was melted down. So this is going to be a whole different understanding, not of the machzis shekel of the korbanos that is annual, but the machzis shekel of the adonim, the sockets, that is a one-time contribution. So here the Sfarim say a very, very interesting pshat. You know, there's a Gemara in Makkas that says Moshe Rabbeinu gave us 613 mitzvahs. Actually, he gave us 611 mitzvahs. 2 mitzvahs we heard from Hashem. Anochi and Lo Yeh Lecha, belief in gods, and thou shalt not have any other gods. Moshe gave us the 611 from, Hashem spoke to Moshe. Moshe gave us the other 611. And this is Merumaz in the Gematria. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us a Torah. What is the numerical equivalent of Torah? Tuf is 400, and Vav is 6, and Reish is 200, that's 606, and Hey is 5, 611. Moshe gave us 611. 2 we heard from Hashem. But then the Gemara in Makkas goes on and says, later generations try to reduce the number of commandments. David got it down to 15. Now you have to understand what that means. That doesn't mean they cut out the mitzvahs, but rather they try to classify the mitzvahs under more general categories, because that way it would be easier for the human intellect to grasp them. Instead of having 613 different details, they try to subsume the 613 under smaller numbers, so a person could think about 10 things or 15 things and be able to incorporate it. So the Gemara in Makkas goes through how different personalities were reducing or subsuming the 613 into smaller numbers. So I'm not going to go through all of the different numbers, but I want to go through towards the end. So it mentions that the Navi Micha, who was a Navi around the time of the exile of the 10 tribes, reduced the Torah to 3 principles. Right, this is actually a very famous pasuk in Micha. Ma Hashem Elokecha Daresh Mimcha. What does God ask of you? God asks of you only 3 things. Asos Mishpat, to do justice. Avas Chesed, to love kindness. V'hatznei leches im Hashem Elokecha, and to walk with Hashem humbly, with humility and modesty. Actually, this is a famous pasuk. It's on some government building. It's on the National Archives or something. There's this pasuk. What does God ask of you? But to do justice, walk, love kindness, and walk humbly with God is the King James translation. It's a very, very famous verse. So the Gemara says, Micha tried to reduce the whole Torah to these 3 fundamental principles. Yeshayahu, who was a contemporary of Micha, got it down to 2 principles. And this is actually the Haftarah we read on a fast day, Mincha. Shimru Mishpat, guard justice. V'yasu tzedakah, and do charity. Now, I just want to stop here, although the main point I want to make is the next step, getting it down to 1, but I want to talk a little bit, as a digression, about the transition between Micha and Yeshayahu, and looking at the difference here. Micha's first principle was Asos Mishpat, to do justice. Yeshayahu changed do justice to Shimru Mishpat, guard justice. So both of them have the word Mishpat there, but one was Asos Mishpat and the other was Shimru Mishpat. I keep that in mind. Now, the second element of Micha was Avas Chesed, loving kindness, loving the doing of kindness. Yeshayahu changed it to asais tzedakah, doing charity. So he changed loving chesed to doing charity. The third element of Micha, to walk with humility, was taken out legamri. So Yeshayahu modified 2 out of the 3 on Micha's list and left out the third one, legamri. Okay, everyone follows this. So what is the pshat in what is going on? So it's very clear that what is being expressed is the Yeridas HaDoros. As the Doros got spiritually weaker, there needed to be a certain modification in how they approached Hashem's demands. Micha emphasizes doing justice. That when you're a judge or whatever, you have to do justice. By Yeshayahu's time, people didn't have the clarity to be able to adjudicate properly. They got mixed up, they got confused. Now the difference between the verb to do and the verb to guard is really a negative idea. So to guard justice is another way of saying don't do injustice. So in a sense, the difference between Micha and Yeshayahu is Micha is calling on you to do justice. Yeshayahu is saying, do no harm. Just get out of the way. Meaning, if you're on a high madrega, you can do justice. But if you're not on a high madrega, it's better not to get involved because you're likely to be makalkel. Right? This is what doctors are told, that the first rule of the doctor's obligation, the Hippocratic oath, is to do no harm. Right? So that's one difference. Now, second difference, you see a similar idea. Micha said, the goal is to love kindness. I should love doing chesed. Now, the problem is, as the Doros gets weaker and weaker, we don't always love helping people. I don't have the emotion. I don't have the passion. I don't have the interest. So what Yeshayahu is saying is, even if you don't have the love of chesed, asais tzedakah, you can still write the check. It's referring to a yerida of the generations. You don't, actually in 2 ways. It changes love to action, and it changes chesed to tzedakah. What is the difference? Gemara and Sukkah, many of you learned, or will learn. What is the difference between chesed and tzedakah? So one of the differences is, chesed is what you do with your body. Tzedakah is what you do with your money. So if I help you, I learn with you, I carry things for you, I give you rides, that's chesed. I write a check, that's tzedakah. Both of them are very good. But chesed is higher than tzedakah, because chesed is begufo, tzedakah is bimamono. But many people who really don't want to do chesed, that takes up too much time for them, they're willing to do tzedakah. So you see this subtle transition here, meaning Yeshayahu takes the midah of justice and formulates it from a positive to a negative. Yeshayahu takes Micha's imperative to love chesed and says, hey, even if you don't love chesed, you can at least do tzedakah, which is important to know. Do something. But then what's curious is Micha's third step, walking with humility and sinius. And this is very important, by the way. We're so used to thinking today that tznius is about the length of a girl's skirt and sleeves, that we don't realize that tznius is not only about clothing. Tznius is an attitude, and it applies to men and women, that in your service of God there has to be humility, to be humble, not to approach Hashem with arrogance and gaiva. Hatznei alechas. Walk with humility. A wonderful quality. So the question is very obvious. Why did Yeshayahu drop it? He dropped the third quality. Right? He reformulated the mishpat standard. He reformulated the chesed standard. But at least he preserved it. He drops the hatznei alechas. So there's an important remez here. Avodas Hashem should certainly be b'tznius. But there are times where you have to be a little more public about what you're doing so that people will learn from it. And Yeshayahu is merames in his omissions, so even omissions are significant. That there are times in which you have to give up your tznius to make a Kiddush Hashem. I knew a story of a fellow, it's kind of a bizarre story, who, he's not alive anymore. He was a Shomer Shabbos, but he certainly was not involved in learning or anything of that nature at all. But he once told me that his father was a big Talmid Chacham, who would stay up the whole night learning. But his father was so humble, he didn't want his own family to ever see him learning. So the son said, I never saw my father open a sefer. After we would be, he found out later, after we would be asleep, he would learn all night. And if any of us got up in the middle of the night, he had a newspaper, which he would cover up the sefer. So I grew up, he said, never seeing my father learn Torah at all. So it was never anything I thought was important. You see the issue here. The father was being so humble. He didn't want his son to even know that he learned. But what's the result of that type of modesty? Your kid doesn't pick up the lesson. So sometimes you got to be a shtickle as a parent, a shtickle bal gaiva. It's not really gaiva. Your child has to see you learn. Your child has to see you daven. And it's not just your child. Your chaverim, your environment, your less observant relatives, your parents. Which means there's a time in which, in a perfect generation where all Jews are keeping the mitzvos, your avodah should be private. Nobody has to know how much you're doing. But at a time when the Torah is weak, you need to be more conspicuous. That's the remez to why Yeshayahu drops Hatznei Alechas. Very, very fascinating, because sometimes Hatznei Alechas is not the right hanhaga. They say, in 19th century Lithuania, in Lita, there actually were Jews who we would describe them as hermits. These were people who would leave their families for the whole week. They would go into the forest. And all they would do, learn, daven, meditate, totally in isolation. And every Shabbos they would go home to be with their families, and then they would leave again for the whole week. Separated from people. Not teaching, not doing anything, just focusing on their own avodas Hashem. Rav Yisrael Salanter was very, very attracted to that derech. What a wonderful thing. Just to focus, get away from the world, get away from distractions. Just focus, meditate. 24/6 hispodidus. 24/6, Shabbos they would come home, because truth is they wouldn't have come home for Shabbos either, but they felt they had chiyuvim, husband and wife, whatever. They had to be with their family once a week. But Rav Yisrael Salanter concluded that as much as he would love that, to be a nister, to be hidden, to be invisible, nobody would know anything about him, he said he couldn't do that. He couldn't do that because there was a generation of Jews that needed to learn Torah, needed to be taught Torah. And he had an acharayas to Klal Yisrael, to Hashem and to Klal Yisrael, not to focus on his own private learning. In fact, they tell interesting stories about this. When Rav Yisrael Salanter wanted to be Machadesh, the Shita of Musar, so he needed to show people he was a Talmud Chacham because they wouldn't respect him. If a guy was not a Talmud Chacham in Shas and Poskim, they would not respect him at all. They say, you have some idea about Avodas Hashem, who are you? So he needed to show that he was a Talmud Chacham, which indeed he was, a Gadol. So he used to go around giving pilpul shiurim, like really involved Gemara shiurim. And he used to put up Mara Makomos, Rishonim, Achronim, and then he would give a brilliant shiur, bowling people over, so people would say, wow, he's a great, and then he would talk about Musar. So the story goes that there were people who wanted to torpedo him, so they switched to Mara Makomos. He put up a shiur that he was going to give on these references, and somebody just compiled totally unrelated references and posted it. So when he comes in and he sees that they're expecting a shiur on all of these other things, which he didn't prepare at all, so he blanched, he turned white for like 30 seconds, and then he came in and he gave a brilliant shiur on those new Mara Makomos that were posted. So Rav Yitzchak Blazer, his Talmud Muvak, said, I want you to know, don't think he needed 30 seconds. He didn't need 30 seconds. He could have gone in instantaneously. Why did he need 30 seconds? Because he had to make a cheshbon hanefesh. Would it be gaiva for me to go in and show people I could even do something that I hadn't seen before? So that was a shaila. Is it gaiva? Is it l'shem shamayim? So it took him 30 seconds to paskin on himself that this was l'shem shamayim, but he could have done it instantaneously. The Chazon Ish, people don't realize, we know the Chazon Ish is such a gadol, but the Chazon Ish, until he was around 54, lived in Vilna. He came to Eretz Yisrael in his 50s. He was a totally private person. He was private. He was not involved in Sorchei Tzibur at all. The first half century of his life, he was only osek in learning and the like. And when the time came, Rav Chaim Ozer wanted him to get more involved in Eretz Yisrael, so he went to talk about, he went to the Chavetz Chaim to talk about what his future should be. And this happens a lot with the Chavetz Chaim, because people would come to talk to the Chavetz Chaim, and the Chavetz Chaim would be talking to a group of people, and somehow the Chavetz Chaim with Ruach HaKodesh answered the question in the crowd that you wanted to ask him. So you actually had your answer. And the Chavetz Chaim was talking about the idea that today no Jew has the luxury of only caring about himself. You have to care about others. And the Chavetz Chaim said something like, do you think it's a big deal to be a Talmud Chacham if all you do is learn yourself and don't help other people? And the Chavetz Chaim said, even I, he said, even I could have been a Talmud Chacham had I just focused on myself. But I didn't focus on myself, so I didn't become such a big Talmud Chacham. Whatever, this is what the Chavetz Chaim said. Even I could have been a big shot had I focused on myself. So that was the Chazon Ish, that was Mamish the Chazon Ish's shaila, and he got his answer, that he had to focus on the tzibur, which of course he did for the next 20 years. Chazon Ish was totally involved in the tzorchei tzibur. So this is the yesod of why Yeshayahu leaves out Hatznei Alechas. Sometimes you got to be public. You got to be public because people have to learn from you. They have to be influenced by you. If you have an ability to influence them, both your children, talmidim, other people, etc. Okay, so we've gone from 3 to 2, but that's not the end of the process. The Navi Habakkuk said even 2 ideas are too much for people to handle. Let's reduce the whole Torah to one principle. Now, this is not the story of Hillel What is hateful to you, do not do to your friend. That's another story of one principle. But in the Gemara Makos, it's a different one principle. And the one principle of Habakkuk, the Navi, is Tzadik bi'amunaso yichya. A tzaddik will live through the power of Emuna. Emuna is the one principle that encapsulates the whole Torah. All 613. Because what does Emuna mean? Emuna means I believe that Hashem is the creator of the world. He is the master of the world. I believe he has a relationship with me, and he wants a relationship with me. I believe he loves me and protects me. I believe that everything in my life is directed by Hashem. When you have Emuna, you know you have to do his will, and you'll want to learn. So it's not that if I have Emuna, I know the whole Torah. I don't know the whole Torah. Obviously, I can have Emuna and I don't know there's a law of Shabbos. But when I have Emuna, I will learn the whole Torah. Because I realize that the purpose of my life is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You understand? That's what we mean when we say Emuna is the foundation of the Torah. Through Emuna, you will learn and you will keep the Torah. So, based on the Gemara in Makos, we can say Emuna is the foundation of Kol HaTorah Kula. Now, let's go back to the Mishkan. We mentioned the basic idea that every person has to build a Mishkan. The word Mishkan means a dwelling place. Every person has to build a dwelling place for Hashem in their heart. These are the famous statement of the Sefer HaCharedim, Bilvavi Mishkain Evnech. In my heart, I build a dwelling place for God. That's why the pasuk says in Truma, V'yasu li mikdash, make for me a Beis HaMikdash, a holy place. Why? V'shochanti b'tocham, so I will dwell in them, not in it, in them, the Jewish people, heart and soul. Right? You have to build a Mishkan of the heart. Now, the reason why everybody gave their own thing to the Mishkan, gold, silver, copper, and there's no uniformity, is if the physical Mishkan is an allusion to the Mishkan we build in our heart, then it has to be different. It can't be uniform. Hashem can't say that everybody does the same thing. People have different talents. There's gold, silver, copper, techelet. These are remazim to the different kochos a person has. So when it comes to building the Mishkan in your heart, we are different. We're not the same. And that's why there's no uniformity in building the Mishkan. But even though there's no uniformity in building the Mishkan, there has to be a uniformity in the foundation of your Mishkan. And we see from the Gemara in Makos that the foundation of the Mishkan is your relationship with Hashem and Torah is Emuna. So the Mishkan mirrors that. Every individual gave something else to the Mishkan. But when it comes to the foundation of the Mishkan, remember the sockets are the foundation. There's commonality because the foundation is a remez to Emuna. Different Mishkan, same foundation. Okay, that's the basic idea. So it turns out, therefore, that the Adonim are a remez to Emuna, because just as the Adonim are the foundation of the Mishkan, Emuna is the foundation of the Mishkan of our heart that we build for Hashem. And the Emuna has to be a common foundation. You have a different mission. He has a different mission. I have a different mission. So our Mishkan is different. But all of us have to have that foundation. Tzadik b'emunasai yichya. So that is why the Adanim are uniform. Every other part of the Mishkan, every individual has a different one. But the Adanim is the commonality of faith. So now we have one other point here. Why are there 2 Adanim per keresh? Meaning every single board, or beam is actually a better translation, because they were beams, they had thickness. Every single beam had 2 prongs, like a plug, and 2 Adanim, meaning each prong was put in an Adan, in a socket. Why 2? Why 2 Adanim? So some say because there are 2 levels of Emuna a person must have. A person must have Emuna in Hashem, and a person must have Emuna in themselves. Rav Tzadok writes in Sitkas HaTzadik, a very, very famous quote, one could actually memorize this. Kishem shechayav adam lahamin ba'kadosh baruch hu. Just as a person is obligated to believe in Hashem, kachu mechuyav lahamin biatzmai. A person must believe in themselves. You know, the t-shirt saying, God doesn't make junk. Very emes. Our neshamos are Hashem's breath. Hashem breathed into us the spirit of life. Vayipach biapav nishmas chayim. Whatever that means exactly, as the Zohar says, if I breathe into you my breath, right, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, I'm breathing into you my life force. Hashem created cows and dogs by dibur. Let there be a dog. But the human being was not created only by dibur, let there be man. The human being was created by neficha, not by the speech of God, but by the breath of God. Very important. A human was created differently than anything else. It wasn't just speech. It was breath. And the difference between breath and speech is in breath, the actual life force of the breather goes into the created entity. That is what we mean when we say the neshama is a chelik, is somehow a portion of divinity. So in every neshama there is greatness, there is holiness, there is goodness. And both the Tanya on the Hasidic side and Rav Chaim Volozhiner on the non-Hasidic side, they make the same point, that the neshama itself can never be corrupted. We do aveiros, so it's as if we're putting dirt on our neshamas. But when you put dirt on a diamond, you're not damaging the diamond. You're covering it up. You're besmirching it. So you got to clean it off. But underneath, the diamond has no pagam. And so too, aveiros are not pogam, the deepest level of a person's neshama. Now the neshama is, the soul is multi-layered. There are 5 souls. There is nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. External parts of the soul can be damaged. But there's a panemius that can never be destroyed. And by the way, al pi Kabbalah, it is that panemius that makes tshuva possible. Because if you've destroyed every part of your soul, there's nothing left which can be reconstituted. There has to be something that's there to enable a reconstruction. And that is the notion that within your neshama, called pintel yid is the way this, the later people talk about it, the little spark of the yid that's inside of you. Pintel yid, never extinguished no matter what. Okay? And that's what we say every morning in davening. Elokai neshama shenasata bi tahora hi. Hashem, the soul that you gave me is pure. It doesn't say was pure. Is pure, meaning to say even now, even if I'm sinful, is pure. Right? This is a very big yesod. The neshama does not get broken. It gets encrusted. Right? So therefore, the notion of the double crushing, the double adonim, is a remez. You have to have faith in yourself. Because if a person feels that they're worthless, a person feels they're no good, that sounds like modesty. But that's really, the Mesilas Yesharim says, that's really the biggest Yetzer Hara, because then a person says, what difference does it make if I learn? What difference does it make if I daven? Who am I? Whatever I do is worthless. So that becomes one big excuse not to become the person that you're able to become. So a person needs to recognize their strength, their maila, their kochas, their abilities, because that's the only way they will truly serve Hashem and become who they're supposed to become. Rav Yerucham, the great mashgiach of Mir, one of the great Balei Musar, before World War II, he was Rav Volba's Rebbe, said, if a person is not aware of his chesronos, he's a fool. If I think I'm perfect, I'm very foolish. I'm kind of stupid. But if I'm not aware of my greatness, it's a tragedy. Because then I will never have never be aware. I have the tools, but I'm not aware that I have the tools to become someone that is great and significant and important. So this is something we need to recognize. They say at the Chazon Ish's Levaya, I think it was 1955, so a bacher was in the Beis HaKvaros in Bnei Brak, and the bacher was sobbing over the loss of the Gadol Hador. So Rav Dessler, who at the time was the mashgiach of Panovich in Bnei Brak, went over to the boy and he said, why are you crying over the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik that's buried there, pointing to the Chazon Ish's grave? He then pointed to the boy, you should cry over the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik that's buried here in you. Because the Rav and the Gaon and the Tzaddik who's buried in the ground became the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik that he was capable of becoming. But the real tragedy is when there's a Rav and a Gaon and a Tzaddik inside of us that never comes out. That's something to cry over. So that's the Adonim, right? So the Adonim, the uniformity of the Adonim. So it's a different message. In other words, what we said yesterday applies to the machzos shekel of the korbanos. But the machzos shekel of the Adonim is a different remez. It's a remez of Emuna, and the double feature is Emuna in Hashem and Emuna in yourself. Oh yes, one more thought I want to mention, and that is, why half shekel? So again, yesterday we talked about interdependence. Here there's a different kinech. This is interesting. The idea of half shekel is that part of Emuna is understanding that you only know half of the story. Meaning, a person has problems with Emuna because they see so many things in the world that don't make sense. They see the righteous people suffering. They see God as concealed and distant and not being involved in things. And they don't see the promises of the Torah being fulfilled. So they think maybe there is no God, or maybe God doesn't care, or maybe the Torah is not true. But the way a Maimon deals with it is, I just know there's a lot of stuff I don't get, and things will be clear later. That's why it's half, right? There used to be a very popular radio show. Paul Harvey was a well-known radio commentator in Chicago. He was nationally syndicated. But his story was, his show was The Rest of the Story. Actually, it's similar to Rebbetzin Samet's book about judging people favorably. You only know part of the story. And the rest of the story was exactly this. He'd tell you a story and it didn't make sense, but if you only knew some more information, now I understand. So that's it. The half shekel reminds you of the limitations of human understanding, and that allows you to have emuna even when times are hard. So it's actually very, very beautiful. The uniformity of the Adanim is because everybody has a different Mishkan, but it has to rest on a common foundation. The double Adanim, faith in God, faith in yourself, and the 1/2 shekel of each, well, not each Adon, but that were melted for the Adanim. Actually, there were many half shekels for each Adon, but everyone gave a half shekel, represents the notion of the incomplete state of human knowledge. And that's why it's a very, very perfect representation of the aspects of Emuna. So this is, again, something that people don't always realize. We have 2 different half shekel mitzvos here. The annual for the korbanos, which we talked about yesterday, and the one-time Trumas HaAdanim for the Meleches HaMishkan. Okay, have a good week and be well.